Alexander Garvin earned both his bachelor's degree and a master's degree in architecture from Yale University. He began working in private practice as a professional architect in the late 1960s, then served off and on starting in the 1970s at different administrative positions in the Planning Department, the Housing and Development Administration, and the Planning Commission for New York City. He was New York's planning commissioner in the late 1990s and most recently was managing director for New York's bid for the 2012 Olympic Games. He has written a number of influential books in the field of urban planning, including The Planning Game and several books about parks and open space. This article, published in 1980, gives an excellent quick review of how federal, state, and city urban renewal policies evolved as reactions to the deterioration of America's central cities in the second half of the 20th century, with a focus on New York City as an example.
The United States became a predominantly urban industrial society in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The deconcentration process described in previous articles gradually emptied out central cities of many of their more prosperous residents and also eventually of many of their jobs. This hollowing out of American central cities left these areas in a very serious trouble. The zone in transition, a byproduct of the deconcentration process, had always had its liabilities, but intensification of the sorting out process transformed these previous disadvantages into a genuine crisis by the middle of the 20th century. City after city erupted in violent riots. Crimes and gangs spread through the streets. Schools deteriorated and dropout rates exploded. The world studied by Elijah Anderson, with its Code of the Streets, emerged as the product of social and economic collapse. Not only city governments, but state and federal officials across the entire country awoke to the mid-century urban crisis. New York City, as Garvin recalls from his own participation at the time, led the way in many respects in terms of attempts to react to this crisis through new public policies. The major city faced a stark choice: either watch passively as the problems of central cities kept growing even larger and more explosive, or attempt some kind of deliberate experimental reaction to try to change the situation and prevent a growing disaster. Many of these experimental policies originated in New York City. In fact, in a number of important cases, the ideas that eventually became national policies adopted by the U.S. Congress took their initial form as innovations adopted by the Housing Office, the Planning Department, or some other part of the New York City administration. An example of New York's pioneering efforts to address the crisis of central cities began in the late 1920s and developed further during the Great Depression era of the 1930s, eventually finding its way to Washington and turning into the Housing Act of 1949. The underlying premise of this approach targeted the old, inferior, and dilapidated housing that had been left behind by better-off residents when they fled to the suburbs. Garvin refers to old law tenement buildings, surviving from earlier decades in the 1800s when very low standards were imposed on builders and landlords. These unhealthy and dangerous buildings had requirements like one toilet for 20 apartments, and some requirements for getting at least a little fresh air into interior rooms. A lot of public speeches were given about what a terrible environment these crowded, broken down, and unhealthy buildings provided for the unfortunate people who ended up living in them. The aim of these early New York City policies and the 1949 Federal Housing Act that grew out of them was to tear down all these dangerous, substandard tenement buildings and to replace them with new, modern apartment buildings that incorporated more windows and fresh air, more open green space around the buildings, and more indoor plumbing and other signs of civilization. The proposed new buildings were strongly influenced by the designs of Le Corbusier, a French artist and architect of the early 20th century, who designed large, multi-story blocks of square, geometric apartment buildings as a way to provide better housing for the urban poor in France. Strange and interesting to note that neither Corbusier nor the planners working in New York City intended for this new housing policy to have any effect on the underlying processes that we've seen at work, producing the sorting out and deconcentration of urban populations and jobs. The policies followed under the 1949 Housing Act have been described as slum clearance, a good description of what was intended. Tear down the bad old housing left over from half a century or more in the past. Build new housing according to designs that were seen as modern at the time, and that was the end of it. Slum clearance amounted to putting old wine in new bottles, that is, doing nothing to fundamentally change the economic processes that produced concentrated poverty in the hollowed-out central cities. In fact, the early efforts at slum clearance were not even concerned about what would happen to the impoverished people who had been living in the old substandard tenements. These early projects involved simply condemning the old buildings, evicting the former residents, and then razing whole areas of the inner city down to the ground and starting over completely. The new replacement construction relocated streets, added parks and sidewalks, installed better water and sewer connections, and placed new, much larger, multi-story apartment blocks within the new design. These new apartments were more costly than the tenements they replaced, so at first many of the former residents of the zone in transition couldn't afford to move back into these new buildings. This problem of what to do with the impoverished former residents, once their tenements were all torn down, became a serious social and policy issue as the planners began to realize what they had done. But at the same time, we should recognize that by clearing out slums and building back more expensive, better quality housing, the city governments of New York and other cities did manage to improve the social profile of the central city. What was good for the central city as a geographic area is not at all the same thing as what was good for the most unfortunate residents who were sometimes displaced from that geographic area. This debate about priorities, about what was good for the central city as a place versus what was good for the people who had been living there, to some extent was embodied by two of the most well-known figures to come out of this process in New York. As a top official in the city government, Robert Moses featured prominently in the history of the city in the 20th century, and also in Garvin's article. Part of Garvin's motive for writing the article, in fact, was to change the way people think about Robert Moses. He has been described as the mastermind behind many of the projects of slum clearance and urban renewal, working with private developers, foundations, and corporations to plan, finance, and execute large-scale modifications to the face of the city. Garvin argues that he was not an all-powerful tyrant, however, but just an ordinary official who happened to be at the right place at the right time and with the right personality to put a number of his ambitious plans into action. But however we interpret his personal style or abilities, it remains clear that the Robert Moses approach was oriented to improving the central city as a place. If that meant cleaning out a lot of the former residents, along with the broken-down old buildings where they had lived, that was not a problem for Moses. In contrast to this orientation toward the central city as a place, citizen activists like Jane Jacobs clearly championed the interests of the people living in the central city as the highest priority. When she found out that her East Greenwich Village neighborhood was slated for one of the Robert Moses slash-and-burn urban renewal projects, she organized such an effective campaign of community organizing and resistance that eventually the city government just gave up and went away, and the neighborhood was not bulldozed to make room for huge, new Corbusier-style high-rise apartment blocks. Jacobs turned this experience into a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which became and still remains a landmark study both for community organizers and in the field of urban planning more generally. Garvin himself was also part of this process of policy experimentation in New York in the middle of the 20th century. In the 1949 Housing Act, the U.S. Congress extended the national legislative framework for urban renewal several times, enacting revised legislation that spanned the third quarter of the 20th century. Each new legislative act brought changes to urban renewal policy. The original blueprint for slum clearance looked entirely to private developers with the intention that they would not only clear away the slums, but also build new, better housing that would retain and even attract middle-class residents back to the central cities. These people were expected to pay higher rents and increase the value of the new housing, and so also the property taxes generated from it. Since this would not be an attractive prospect for developers, compared to building new suburbs on cheap open land, the Housing Act provided financial subsidies for cities to pay the developers, covering about 3/4 of their costs to redevelop inner-city areas. To ensure a large enough area for economies of scale, the first projects negotiated by Robert Moses between private developers and the city of New York had a minimum size of 12 acres. Typical zoning densities vary from 1 or 2 units per acre in a very low-density residential neighborhood with detached single-family houses, to up to dozens of units per acre in a very high-density neighborhood with multi-story apartment buildings. A typical slum clearance project could displace thousands of people and replace them with thousands of new and different people. These massive early projects, taken on for profit by private developers, had no provision for what would happen to the displaced population. The original poor residents, almost always black, were a separate city problem to be dealt with through other different policies and projects. Some early critics, like civil rights activist James Baldwin, suggested that urban renewal really meant Negro removal. By 1954, renewed federal legislation added rehabilitation of existing housing to the possible range of activities covered by the federal renewal subsidies. This was less attractive to developers because it usually meant a smaller scale of operation, less efficiency, and less profit. Congress also proposed phasing in of redevelopment for an area to avoid displacing hundreds or even thousands of residents all at once, disrupting related local retail economies. These changes produced what became known as the vest pocket development period, with a larger number of smaller areas gradually cleared and rebuilt, along with some renovations and upgrades of existing buildings. The 1959 revision of urban renewal legislation was called the Community Renewal Program, continuing the emphasis on a smaller scale combination of replacing some substandard housing and renovating other neighboring buildings. Provisions also were added to allow federal funds to support comprehensive planning work, giving a boost to the emerging profession of urban planners. But the people in charge of these efforts in New York City were getting more and more uncomfortable with one glaring omission from all of these renewal efforts. All these projects were still all about houses and not about people. The underlying assumption seemed to be that the old, run-down, substandard tenements were the cause of all the other problems, not that they might be the result of these problems instead. It is true that the older tenements in the poorest neighborhoods sometimes posed real health hazards for their residents. The hollowness of the architecture-oriented assumption probably was best illustrated by the Pruitt-Igoe development in St. Louis. 33 huge 11-story apartment buildings were built on the cleared land where an impoverished black population had been living, segregated into an older, run-down neighborhood of substandard housing. In this case, the new apartment towers were built not to lure new affluent middle-class residents into the central city, but simply to improve the housing conditions of the impoverished population that already had been living there. It was an ideal test of the architectural assumption. It turned out, though, that concentrated poverty is still concentrated poverty, whether you locate it in outdated, run-down tenement houses or shift it into brand new apartment buildings with the latest plumbing and design features. The flight of jobs and people to the suburbs meant that the complex couldn't keep enough residents in the buildings to cover maintenance costs. A vicious spiral of rising vacancy rates, insufficient rental income, lack of funds for maintenance, and deterioration of the buildings made things steadily worse. Property damage, violent crime, and the code of the streets rapidly swallowed up Pruitt-Igoe, driving its residents to despair and anger. It was a relief to everyone involved when the whole place was dynamited starting in 1972. The New York planners realized that they needed to address directly the question of where poverty populations would go when their old substandard housing was cleared away. As Garvin relates, they decided already in the late 1960s to pursue a policy of developing what they called scatter site housing to relocate these impoverished residents, attempting to break up the concentration of poverty in large continuous areas of the city. This policy was based partly on national studies and reactions to the urban riots of this period, already discussed in relation to other readings. One of these scatter sites was planned in the late 1960s for the Forest Hills community in the Bronx, perhaps better known as the site of an annual tennis tournament. The project, first proposed for a neighboring part of the Bronx, was shifted to Forest Hills after behind-the-scenes protests from the original site community. As soon as the plans were announced for Forest Hills, angry public protests broke out. Mario Cuomo, then a Queens lawyer appointed by Mayor Lindsay as a mediator, brokered a compromise that reduced the size of the projected complex from 6 24-story towers to 3 12-story buildings with 432 apartments, 40% of which would be set aside for senior citizens. Cuomo tells the story of this process in his 1974 book, Forest Hills Diary. This example of attempts to relocate concentrated poverty populations proves how difficult it can be to swim against the tide of urban deconcentration. Planners wanted to scatter poverty households out across the metropolitan area in an effort to prevent the critical mass that might generate Anderson's Code of the Streets and similar social problems. But the other side of the coin of poverty concentrated in one neighborhood is privilege concentrated in a different neighborhood. People who manage to establish themselves in a community of concentrated privilege are not happy about efforts to interfere with this running social and economic tide and to remix the different groups of urban residents so they're living together in the same neighborhoods. Eventually, the contradictions built into the urban renewal movement worked themselves out into the open clearly enough for everyone to see, even the politicians in Washington. The idea that the housing itself was the root problem was exposed as nonsense by projects like Pruitt-Igoe. Social resistance to relocating people who had been segregated on the basis of the double stigma of ethnicity and economic poverty showed that you couldn't just replace all the poor people with new middle-class Central City residents living in new, modern apartments. All those poor people had to go somewhere else, and there was no place else obvious for them to go. By 1973, the Nixon administration canceled the entire urban renewal program as a failed policy idea. To attempt ambitious projects, completely rebuilding large sections of a deteriorating Central City, when you can rely on 3 out of every $4 coming from Washington to pay the private developers and ensure their profits. But when the federal money dries up, what do cities do about the problems caused by sorting out of people and jobs? How do leaders react to deconcentration of the metropolitan area? Garvin gives us some first-hand insights into the ways that New York City officials adapted to the situation in the late 1970s after urban renewal programs disappeared from the congressional budgets in Washington. He mentions 3 different categories of policies that were affected. The first category he calls redevelopment. This had been the major focus during the quarter century of federal government subsidies, from early slum clearance programs to later vest pocket projects that replaced substandard neighborhoods and that also tried to relocate people who couldn't afford to stay in the new and improved area after the project was finished. This redevelopment category experienced the greatest scaling back of activities simply because it had been receiving the lion's share of development money and projects in the earlier period. However, redevelopment continued as a cooperative activity between the City of New York and private developers. The second category is historic preservation. Garvin points out that these efforts to identify, preserve, and protect historic places that embodied the heritage of a city and the people living in it did not stop. Since they did not rely mainly on federal financial subsidies, but more on federal legal recognition and regulation, these programs survived the end of urban renewal and in fact have survived down to the present day. The weight of federal laws remains important for reinforcing these efforts at preserving heritage. But it is important to recognize that while such efforts are a valuable and appropriate activity for local governments and community leaders, historic preservation has only a very small, marginal connection to the issue of stratification and segregation of urban populations based on ethnicity and social class. Preservation does not address the problems of urban deconcentration, including separation of the city into enclaves of privilege and areas of concentrated poverty. The third category of city planning is provision for neighborhood facilities, including places like parks, libraries, and community centers. This aspect of planning actually experienced some strange and less than helpful transformations during the quarter century of federally subsidized urban renewal. After the city had seized the buildings in old substandard neighborhoods by eminent domain, private developers were happy to take contracts to make a profit by tearing them down. They were less eager to try to build and sell new housing in many of these central city neighborhoods, fearing the risk that their investments in new construction would not pay off. Residents who could afford the new housing might not want to move into these neighborhoods. So eventually, after torn-down neighborhoods had been standing empty for a while, many cities decided to use some of their federal subsidy money to help the private developers construct non-residential facilities instead, such as football stadiums, parking garages, and other large and profitable projects that now stand where neighborhoods used to be in many of our central cities. Post-urban renewal period after 1973, however, the remaining federal support for cities in the new Housing Act rolled all three of these types of policies and programs into a single number, awarded to the city as a block grant. Cities then were able to shift the funds around between these three different uses, which practically guaranteed that continued efforts to do something about the housing situation of the poorest city residents would move downward toward the bottom of the list. Thrown back on their own resources, as they had been before 1949, officials in New York City continued to innovate. Garvin is especially proud of some new policies developed by the city starting in the late 1970s to encourage private renovation of housing. He says these new policies allowed New York to continue making at least some small progress on the housing problem, even after the massive federal subsidies dried up. The first of these innovations relates to property taxes. One of the problems with investing a lot of money into renovating an old brownstone or other building in the center of an American city is that after you make the improvements, the market value of the property increases. When the property assessor comes around, this means your property taxes will go up. So property tax increases act as a barrier, a disincentive against renovations and improvements to existing housing. Recognizing this, New York City moved in the opposite direction. The J51 program allows a 30-year exemption from increased property taxes for renovated houses that qualify as affordable, that is, available to poorer residents, and a 10-year exemption from higher taxes for other renovations to more expensive apartments or condominiums. The program also allows an actual reduction in property tax rates for these structures during the same period. Catch is that landlords have to agree to include this housing as rent-controlled and to limit the rent increases that they can charge during the protected period. This property tax modification has stimulated an impressive amount of private activity to improve housing in the city, and Garvin urges other cities and even the federal government to learn from New York's experiment, as has happened so often in the past. The city also put some of the remaining federal money for development into a community fund from which people can borrow to match funds borrowed from banks and other lenders, making it financially easier to get started on such private renovation projects. Garvin believes that another big incentive could help with such private grassroots efforts at renewal and renovation. A federal insurance program, like the very successful FHA-insured mortgages for suburban development, would not add any major cost to the federal budget. It would focus on insuring loans used for rehabilitation of central city housing, instead of loans used to build new suburban subdivisions. Just as private lenders were happy to make such federally guaranteed loans in the suburbs, Garvin thinks they would be equally happy to make federally insured loans for central city renovation and preservation. These tools might well prove important in allowing central cities to reinvent themselves and prosper in the future. But none of these policies recommended by Garvin a generation ago address the underlying issue of urban deconcentration and segregation. All these ideas are still about houses rather than people. Few, if any, of the buildings he is talking about renovating in central cities belong to the people who live in them. Tax incentives and loan insurance could be a boon for landlords, but if the city continues to sort itself out into increasingly segregated neighborhoods where rich and poor people live isolated from each other, the core issue of concentrated poverty will remain as a troubling challenge to the stability and quality of urban life.